Hi, Life Group leaders. Today we're looking at session 6 entitled No Compassion. This is for October 9th, and it's covering Jonah 4, verses 1 through 11. Last week, the lesson concludes with Jonah being spat up on the ground by the great fish that the Lord had prepared for him. And chapter 3 details the prophesying to the Ninevites and the subsequent repentance of the city. The prophecy Jonah was commanded by God to deliver was brief. In 40 days, Nineveh will be demolished. Depending on the scholarly information you read, there may be some differing opinions on the size of Nineveh. Did it take him 3 days because it was so big? Perhaps. There's a school of thought based on the practices of that day that in large cities like Nineveh, Jonah would have had to travel to preach in several sections of the city to be heard by the largest amount of the population. Regardless of this detail of the story, the result was amazing. After 3 days of a rather pointed and hopeless prophecy, Nineveh, known for their wickedness and under the threat of God's impending judgment, turns to the Lord. They declared a fast and dressed in sackcloth, a symbol of their grief and repentance. This news reaches the king of Nineveh, and he too tears his royal robes and sits on an ash heap as a public display of his repentance. Then he makes a royal decree causing the fast to be a citywide ordinance. The Lord took notice of their repentant spirits and relented from the devastation that he threatened to send upon them. Interesting to note, today's lesson is entitled No Compassion. But at the end of chapter 3, we see God's compassion on full display. Here's where today's lesson picks up. The writer of today's lesson breaks chapter 4 into 3 sections, and for continuity's sake, I'll stay with those sections. And the first one is entitled Contempt. A revival breaks out in the capital of Assyria, and Jonah gets mad. As I heard it preached before concerning this passage, disappointment occurs when our appointment doesn't meet with God's appointment. Jonah is a great example of that. He has no love for the Assyrians, and the idea of having to prophesy to the citizens of the capital, these Gentiles, the enemies of God's people, Jonah had no real desire to do so. They weren't like him. They didn't belong to the chosen people of God. They were different. Instead of Jonah being in awe of what God has done, he becomes angry with God. Look what he says in verse 2. It says he prayed to God. But it's not so much a prayer of petition. It's not a prayer of repentance. It's an opportunity for Jonah to accuse God of being true to his nature. He uses God's own attributes as a basis for his indicting God for being God. Kind of a ridiculous argument, but don't we do some ridiculous things sometimes when we get angry? Jonah wanted God to destroy Nineveh. Jonah wanted to see fire and brimstone fall on his Gentile Assyrian enemies, and instead God has used his prophecy to transform a pagan nation. Then the Lord turns to Jonah and asks, "Is it right for you to be angry?" There is such a thing as righteous anger, righteous indignation. And that's anger and upset feelings based on things that make God angry. Yes, I think we should be angry at sin. I think we should be angry when it comes to injustice. I think we should be angry with all forms of corruption and rebelliousness. God is. That doesn't mean we necessarily have to always be angry at people. The Lord's question to Jonah is rhetorical. God knows Jonah's anger is not right. Jonah needs to discover it now. Yeah, at this point, you can take a moment to consider the dangers of prejudices and self-centeredness in the life of the believer and how such attributes can marginalize one's effectiveness. The second area of emphasis is called anger, and it's covering verses 5 through 9. Instead of stopping to consider the question, Jonah leaves the city and goes to the east, sets up a little lean-to, and waits to see what's going to happen next. Though Jonah was angry with God, God remains true to his character. Just as he provided a great fish for Jonah, now he will provide a plant for Jonah, and Jonah will use it as a shade. How does Jonah respond? Well, Jonah's happy with the plant. He's satisfied with the plant and the shade that it provides him. Interestingly enough, he never takes the opportunity to thank God for his provision. Not only does God prepare a plant, but God prepares a worm. Some would say this was a grape worm that attacked vineyards, but in a day's time, the plant withers because of this worm. Jonah's response to the withered vine was one of despair and desperation. He was on the brink of fainting because of the heat. The sun was beating down on him. They said there was a scorching east wind, which is kind of ironic because he went to the east of Nineveh, and the easterly wind in that region was called the mountain wind, and it normally brought rain. And this time it's not just the heat of the sun, but there's a heat in the breeze. It comes together just to make things feel like a blast furnace. It's just hot. And Jonah's already irritated. He's angry with God. Things didn't turn out the way he thought it should. And he's about to faint in all this heat. Once again, God questions Jonah about the validity of his anger. But this time he asks about Jonah's anger concerning the plant's death. Jonah answers the Lord, and he claims to be in the right. And he's so mad he wished he were dead. At this moment, take some time to compare and contrast Jonah's attitudes and feelings towards the Ninevites and that withered vine. Consider how anger and bitterness can blind us to the spiritual needs of those around us. See, Jonah's anger made it impossible for him to properly see or embrace all that God was doing in and through him. And thus, when you lack God's perspective, you become negligent to his purposes and priorities. Finally, compassion. In verses 10 and 11. In this heated exchange between God and his pouting prophet, God seizes a teachable moment to reason with Jonah concerning the bigger picture. Jonah was consumed by this withered plant, a plant that he neither planted, he didn't water it, he did nothing for the plant. He could have at least picked a worm off of it. God prepared the plant. God prepared the worm. Jonah sat in the shade and sulked, but he was more concerned with a plant's welfare than the lives of those Ninevites. You can go down several rabbit holes in this area. Be careful which one you go down. When Jonah thought of Nineveh, he saw an evil and wicked community, a pagan nation, unworthy of compassion of any kind. However, to prove that our viewpoints and opinions are not always in line with God's, look how God saw the Ninevites. He asked Jonah another rhetorical question here at the end of the book. So may I not care about the great city of Nineveh, which has more than 120,000 people who cannot distinguish between their right and their left, as well as many animals. In essence, God is asking Jonah, If you can love that vine that much, as you obviously do, can't I love the city of Nineveh at least that much? We don't ever get Jonah's response to that. And I think the open-ended conclusion to the book is a great opportunity for us to do some self-evaluation as well. Take a moment to discuss ways believers can be compassionate to those around us who may not share our cultural and spiritual backgrounds. Some food for thought. If we're God's children, shouldn't our passions and our priorities and perspectives reflect His? Do we have an eternal perspective when it comes to the spiritual lives of others? When we view our actions and attitudes towards others, do we more resemble Jonah or God? More importantly, how would God answer that question? Hope you have a great week, and hope to see you Sunday. Have a nice day.